Hi everybody, I'm Steve, and apparently my slides are a little long that way, but I don't have too much out there, so that should be okay. But today I want to talk to you about designing Hypermedia APIs. First, I am Steve, as we just said. I hack on hackety-hack. So hackety-hack is the best way for people that don't know programming to learn the basics of programming. It's a desktop app for Mac, Windows, and Linux that allows you to go from I know nothing to I know something. So that's what I spend most of my time on. When I'm not working on that, other educational stuff, I teach classes with Jeff at Jumpstart Lab. So Jumpstart Lab Conf, woohoo, thanks for attending. But yeah, we teach the best Ruby and Rails classes in the world. One day, I went searching for the meaning of how to make slides fit on the screen, also known as REST. So ultimately, this presentation is a story, and it's a story about this journey that I've been on. You can kind of think of me as someone from our community who has wandered off into the desert, right? And they come back stumbling into town with like their hair all crazy, right? Like half chopped off, and they're like covered in dirt. And you're like, man, what happened to you? And you're like, dude, I saw the most insane thing out in the middle of the wilderness, and I have to tell you about it. It's going to change your life. So this is sort of this idea. I have a principle of like lifelong learning, so I'm always trying to learn something new. And basically, I file away things I'd like to learn in the future, and then when I have time, I go investigate them. So I kept seeing people online say things like, oh, well, I mean, that's not actually RESTful. And like, oh yeah, I mean, that's how some people think REST works, but like, that's not really what REST works. And after I see people say things like this 2 or 3 times, I sort of file away, like, check on this idea and see if these people are full of crap or not. And so eventually, you know, I got bored one day and I was like, I saw someone say this. And I was like, okay, so let me find out what this actual REST thing is like. And so this is that story, and I want to share with you what I have discovered about the true nature of REST. So the first thing I want to tell you about REST is that REST is over. I don't know if you've seen Portlandia or not, but basically the first thing about real REST is that there's sort of this nanescence movement along the Restafarians, as we call ourselves, to basically we're giving up the term REST. So in the rest of this presentation, when I say REST, I mean what Rails thinks REST is and what you all think REST is right now, and not what REST actually is in a real sense. Because basically, when you, I don't know how many of you are involved in sort of like global social justice movements, but there's this idea that you don't call good protester bad protester on people, because if you spend time in front of the media, you shouldn't be fighting over like who is breaking windows and not breaking windows. You should be talking about like your actual mission, right? Like, why waste time talking about like what's happening on the street when you should be talking about your message? And so with REST, we have this message of how to build APIs in a way that is scalable, in a way that is long-lasting, and a way that is more flexible than the way that everybody else is doing them. So we shouldn't be squabbling over terminology, because that's stupid, and it detracts from the point of how to actually build APIs in a long-lasting way. And so we're just dropping REST. Like, it's done, whatever. Twitter and all those people that have fake REST APIs can just have it, and like we're going to go on and do something else. So that's the reminder. In the rest of this talk, I might say REST a couple times. Unless I've added a disclaimer in the negative, I'm going to be talking about the Rails REST crap that's not actually REST. And instead, we're getting rid of REST APIs, and we're going to call them Hypermedia APIs. There's a very specific reason for this that I'll get into a little bit later, but basically, the first book by O'Reilly was published recently. It's really awesome, called Building Hypermedia APIs with HTML5 and Node, and Node is totally irrelevant to the content of the book. If you're interested in real REST, you should buy it and read it. It's written by a friend of mine, and it's awesome. So Hypermedia APIs are what I'm here to explain to you how to build and why they're awesome, Hypermedia being real REST. After this, no more saying the word REST. So some background. At the end of this slide, there's designing Hypermedia APIs. So this is 3 words, and you need to know all 3 of them in order to make sense of my talk. And so I'm going to explain them to you backwards. So we're going to start with APIs, then we're going to move into what Hypermedia is, and then we're going to talk about how you actually design a Hypermedia API. So yeah. So an overview of APIs. And you might be thinking like, oh man, I already know what APIs are, but I doubt it. So there are 4 major architectural styles to APIs. And what I mean by architectural style is the same thing as like buildings or paintings. So a style is a particular set of guidelines you can sort of categorize things by. So I don't know anything about art, and I always use this example, and I really need to look it up, but Impressionism is the example I always use. So there's no like RFC 2100 that tells you what Impressionist paintings are, right? There's no checklist for Impressionist paintings. You know an Impressionist painting when you see it because it has certain characteristics. So these are styles of architecture for building APIs and how they're categorized. The first one is RPC, or Remote Procedure Calls. So here's an example of making an API call to a JSON RPC. There's also XML RPC if that floats your boat. But basically the idea is that you post a method name and some parameters to an endpoint, and you get some sort of result back, right? Like it is a remote procedure call. You're calling things somewhere else. So its sort of philosophy on life is to make a method call over the internet. It's very like C, non-object oriented, like call this function, give me some data back, right? And this is really simple, and there are good reasons to use this. It's very legible, it's easy to understand. There's not a lot of complication. It sort of tunnels things over HTTP. It doesn't really use any of the features of HTTP, but people have built lots of software using RPC, including all of you when you build Rails applications. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So SOAP, SOAP, XML, oh no. Basically, SOAP works in a similar fashion. It stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. Simple is now sort of disputed, obviously, but the basic idea is that you're serializing objects, sending them over the wire, and then unserializing them on the other side, and it gives you some sort of object. So it goes from like procedural programming, a stupid RPC, to our object-oriented SOAP. Just like active resource. Oops, did I say that? It's basically SOAP. From an architectural standpoint, you're doing the same kind of thing, right? Serializing objects, sending them over the wire, unpickling them on the other side. So yeah, that's SOAP's big reason for existing. Send an object over the wire. So okay, REST is this kind of thing. So you have some sort of HTTP verb that's not post. Oh no. And then you have some sort of resource and maybe an ID, and you pass it in some parameters, gives you a response back. You use get and put and post and delete and all these verbs to manipulate these resources, and you do stuff to them. And so it is structurally identical to RPC, except for instead of one endpoint, you have tons of endpoints. So you're making those same sort of procedure calls. If I call posts to slash articles, if I call post to slash articles, that's not any different than me sending a create posts or create article method call, right? It's the exact same freaking thing. Just a slight different idea. So there is value in this, and the reason I separate it out from RPC is that even though it's very similar, the multiple endpoints gives you some flexibility and readable URLs and all that kind of stuff. So like, I would much rather work with this style of API than the other styles. I don't want to totally denigrate it in the sense that like we're building APIs this way right now, and they work mostly, and there's not a fail whale going on. But so this is the current gold standard for the way that we sort of do things. And so lastly, there's Hypermedia. So this sort of almost is off the slide. I apologize for some of you who are in the back. But basically, with Hypermedia, you get some sort of Hypermedia format. You request from it, and it returns to you links to other resources. So in this case, I have a feed link, and it gives me some sort of href attribute that tells me where to go next to solve my business process. And so I hit the endpoint, I follow these links, and that guides me through the business process, as opposed to me needing to know where all these resources are and what I want to do with them. So hypertext is the engine of application state. You may have heard of this if you listen to any of my other talks or read my rambling blog. Helios is this magical idea that all of your resources are connected to each other and you follow the links. So that's what separates a Hypermedia API from the Rails style of things, is this web, this network of resources. The links are really, really important. And that's the number one reason why Rails is not real REST, is that like you don't provide links to other stuff in your representations if you call your API, unless you're the Spire.io guys, who I talk about all the time now because they do this. So, as a recap, 3 styles and the one off the slide. RPC, remote procedure calls, calling methods over the internet. SOAP, getting objects over the internet. REST, RPC with tons of different endpoints, one for each resource you want to manipulate. And Hypermedia, which is about using Hypermedia formats to follow the web of state machines you're going to be doing things with. Some additional definitions about APIs that I want to talk about some things. So Hypermedia, in order to really understand what Hypermedia means, you need to understand what hypertext means. So as Shane alluded to, hypertext is text that's displayed on a computer with or other electronic documents with references or hyperlinks to other text objects. Man, this is a small screen. So this was invented by Ted Nelson, or coined by Ted Nelson back in the day, but basically Hypermedia is just generalizing hypertext to all media, so non-textual mediums with links. They're basically used synonymously by everyone now. You can sort of say one or the other, everybody knows what you're talking about, but realistically, hypertext is dead, long live Hypermedia. We care about things that are not just plain text. So, the other thing is media types. So media types, you might know them as MIME types. A MIME type is the specific, like HTML spec, not HTML, but the MIME spec, but whatever, we use it with browsers. Media type is a more generic word for MIME types. But basically, it's a way of identifying the structure of a document. So you might have like application JSON or text HTML. This is like metadata that describes how the document is actually built. And so we use these to communicate semantics about the thing that we're transferring. So like if I'm transferring JSON, if I give you something that says it's of MIME type application JSON, you better be able to use a JSON parser to just deconstruct it, right? And if I say it's text HTML, you're going to use Nokogiri to parse it, and it would be unfortunate if I served you something with the wrong content type. This is why XHTML died, is because Microsoft refused to respect the application XHTML content type, and so you couldn't actually parse it in Internet Explorer. It's a long story. But basically, it's really important to have these media types. They are like the treaties. They communicate between the client and server and tell us what the semantics of our documents are saying. So, Hypermedia APIs. Now that we're talking, we got APIs down, so let's talk a little bit about what a Hypermedia API looks like. So, Hypermedia API consists of 3 things. HTTP, MIME, and specifically Hypermedia MIME types. HTTP covers how stuff gets sent over the wire. It is an application-level protocol that is concerned about getting some text from point A to point B. You can use non-HTTP protocols if you want, but none of them exist, so it's sort of a silly academic distinction at the moment until somebody else invents one. But basically, HTTP works. MIME describes the stuff that gets sent, the schema of the document in a way, the structure, the semantics of the things that we're transferring. So HTTP is how, MIME is the what, and then Hypermedia is that we want a specific kind of MIME type that has these links to other resources, because the links are what's really, really important. So the specific type is Hypermedia. So you need those 3 things. So we got HTTP, you need to use proper MIME types, and those MIME types need to be Hypermedia formats. So, why do we use HTTP as opposed to making up some other protocol? Well, if you read Roy Fielding's thesis, which I have several times, it's actually really readable, it's really dense. I always joke that I was heavily influenced by reading Marx at the same time that I was reading Roy Fielding, because both of them are these like really crazy thinkers who have these really thick vocabularies, and you need to know the terminology in order to understand what they're saying. So like I could tell you that the rest, section 5 of Fielding's thesis is like 6 pages long, but it's 6 really dense pages, and you probably will not know what he's talking about unless you do software architecture stuff. So with one more bullet that's off the bottom of the screen, these are all the things that you need to be RESTful. There's like there's 2 off the bottom of the screen actually. There's 6 main constraints and then 4 sub-constraints from the uniform interface constraint. The important part of why we use HTTP is because if you use HTTP, you get all of these things except the last subsection of the uniform interface constraint. So that's why we call them Hypermedia APIs. The last constraint is that Hypermedia must be the engine of your application's state. And therefore, this is why REST is a stupid name, and why I'll gladly give it to all those people that don't know what they're talking about, because the focus should be on Hypermedia, because that is the fundamental transformative difference that's different between what we're currently doing and how we should be building these new layers of APIs. So all this other crap, if you're using HTTP properly, which is sometimes a big if, but in the Rails community we're pretty good about this, you get all this other stuff for free, which is really nice, because I like things for free. So yeah, so you don't want to do stuff like this, so the get photos 12 delete. Obviously this is kind of silly. So that's like not using HTTP correctly. Like you're technically using it correctly, but not really, right? Like yeah. So so MIME and Hypermedia sitting in a tree, they sort of work together to describe the types of documents, and we want Hypermedia documents specifically. So that's sort of the overview of what a Hypermedia API would look like. Transferring hypermedia from one section of the web to the other. So what I'm going to lay out now is sort of like 5 steps of designing an API in this style. And in this part, it will be a lot more concrete. So if you're kind of like dazed over and wondering what I'm even talking about, this might like make it a little more clear. I always find one of the hard parts about learning about REST and Hypermedia is that basically everything is super general. So Roy Fielding's thesis was based on codifying what had already existed on the internet. He took the way the web works and then wrote a thesis about it. And so in the back of your mind, if you're thinking about these things, you should be making an analogy to the web, because the web is the concrete implementation of these abstract ideas. And so you can always make those analogies from the abstract to the concrete. So I'm going to try to make those the same, like design a Hypermedia API from scratch. So there's 5 steps, one of which is off the screen. So basically, you evaluate your business processes. What stuff do you want the API to actually do? Then you create a state machine that represents a user. What steps do they go through and in what order? How do they connect together to make those business processes work? This is where this state transfer comes in REST. Evaluate the media type needs that you have for your application. Build those media types. And then step 5 is go ahead and implement it. So it's fine that it's off the screen because it's hand wavy anyway. So a wild example appears. I have a friend, Jamie Nesta, who is a student at Mendicant University, which if you don't know is super awesome. Gregory Brown is doing a lot of stuff to educate people who are intermediate developers and make them super badass developers. But he made this website called w3clove.com. If you've ever used the W3 site to validate your HTML, which I'm sure you all do because you're good web citizens, you want to make sure your HTML is valid, right? No, I'm the only one that does that on the entire internet. But basically, it lets you put in one website only, and then it gives you back whether your web page is valid. So this W3C Love website lets you put in your web page, and it will trawl up to 100 pages of your app and tell you what all of the errors are, which is really cool when you're trying to you think everything's valid and you want to double check once you're getting down to those last couple errors. And so he wanted to build an API on top of this, and so he's like, Steve, you know all these things about APIs. Here's my API. What do you think of it? And it's not bad in any way, but it's very standard what we would build for Rails REST-y stuff. So what currently exists is you make a GET request to /API/v1/sitemaps/check, and you pass in a URI that's URL encoded. I didn't encode it here, but you pass in one parameter, and then it will check your stuff, give you some data back. It gives you this sort of JSON response, right? Created as, scraped at, blah, 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 a whole bunch of stuff. The web pages it scrapes, all these kinds of things. Very standard. This is what we're used to talking about, right? You hit some sort of resource, it gives you some data back. There's also a web pages API that lets you check a particular page. Looks very similar. Web pages check, pass in a URI parameter, some hosts, and it does that. So let's take a step back. So that's how it currently works. These two endpoints, these two sort of functions, we want to turn them into Hypermedia-driven processes instead. So think about the business processes you would need to do even these two little things that are sort of function calls. You can imagine that there might later be multiple step things. So the canonical example that people always use in the REST community is ordering a cup of coffee. How to get a cup of coffee is this article that's really great that shows you a more complicated series of states. This is only have 30 minutes, so I wanted to give you a really simple one. So there's two basic processes, this web site and this web, the full site API. So sitemaps and web pages are the terms that he used for the two sort of business processes that you want. So we want to build that state machine to describe what our business process looks like. I always think these graphs are awesome. As soon as I saw Aaron Patterson start to put these dot graphs on slides, I was like, I want to do that with every single presentation. So this is sort of a state machine, if you can imagine, of the business process that we go through. So we enter at the root. We might want to request a form to determine how to actually hit the web page API and how to hit the sitemap API. If you think about it, we have those parameters we need to pass in, right? So we have to ask the website, like, hey, how would you like your parameter to be given to you? So we request a form, and then we process that form and we submit it to an endpoint which returns us our information, this display function, because it's a link back to our root. So we can like transfer from the root to the web page API, get some sort of data back, go back to the root, transfer maybe another one, maybe try another site, whatever. But this is the basic state machine. I decided that this one sort of sucked, so I built this one that splits them apart so you can sort of see these are two independent processes, right? Like you're displaying two kinds of different things. But that's the basic flow through our application. The astute reader will notice this is also very similar to the way that you browse websites on the internet. You go to the home page, you click some links, you follow a process. When you're trying to like narrow your conversion funnel, you look at how many steps you need to go from home page to purchase and try to minimize those things. So there's some relations in there that I don't have time to get into, but this is sort of the state machine for this API. So now that we know we need to do this kind of stuff, we need to evaluate our media type needs. Unfortunately, sorry to tell you, but JSON can't drive a real Hypermedia API. It just can't. Sorry. We love JSON, we hate XML. The good and bad news is you can't use XML either. So you're probably like, Steve, what the hell? I want to use JSON, I want to use XML. So the problem is this. I want to represent a link in JSON. How do you do it? There's no way to do it, right? So it's not a Hypermedia format. However, you can use the JSON serialization format and add semantics on top of it that add linking. So you can say, like, in my special kind of JSON, I'm going to have this link element, and it's going to have an href and a rel attribute, and that will be the semantics that will agree upon how to link things. So I don't mean, when I say JSON can't drive your API, I don't mean that you have to give it up as like a serialization format. It's just you can't use naked JSON. Like, application JSON is not good enough, because there's no way of communicating links. So you got to build a media type on top. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to build a Hypermedia semantics on top of JSON. All right. So we'll create this media type. So media type design is basically just as much of an art as it is a science. There's lots of fussing, and I could literally give a whole hour, 2-hour talk on how to design media types. So I'm going to sort of blow through this just like everything else. This talk is very high level for a reason. But basically, we need to define our data elements, and we need to define our Hypermedia controls, which are things like links and form that show you how to like interact, follow links, template stuff. And the data elements are all the data that gets returned, right? So in this particular example, we're going to build this type called w3clove.validation plus JSON. And that basically means the plus JSON means we're building on top of JSON. The validation is the name for our type. We're going to namespace that. So the real fully qualified media type is application/VND, which is vendor, .w3clove, prefixing it with our own website, .validation plus JSON. So that's the type our API is going to use to communicate. So so let's define this validation type. Again, the plus JSON means you build it on top of JSON, so we can use a JSON serializer to do stuff. So we have these data elements that we want to have. So the created at time, the scraping success, Boolean, which URL we were scraping. These are all the data elements. So we would like write up a document that says, in this media type, you may, or you must, or you might, get these particular attributes back. They'll be of this particular type. We sort of would define all of those things out. So a response may contain created at, scraping success, all this junk that we need, all these elements. Then we need Hypermedia controls. So it would say something like a response may include a forms element, which is an array of objects. They would have an href, a rel, and you'd be able to follow those links to, that's how we're going to define a link in our type. So those are sort of the two things. We're also going to define two types of links. So we have a sitemap form link, which means that when you follow that link, you'll get a resource which will give you a form back for processing a sitemap API, business process. And the sitemap type will be processing a form that has that type, will give you the data associated with that sort of validation process. And then we implement it. So here's the example. This is going to be a little tiny since the screen is tiny. But basically, if you imagine a request method that would call, hit some sort of URL and ask for our media type of vndw3clove.json, it would give us back these two links. Hey, we have a website form, we have a sitemap form, you can follow these two hrefs, and the URLs are actually just ... So even though they're off the screen, it's not that big of a deal. But basically, it's totally opaque to the users. So when we get back these two links, we would be able to trawl through those links, find the one where the rel equals the sitemap form, and grab the href attribute out of that subtype. Which is, this sort of JSON thing, right? So we want to look for that rel and grab the href associated with it. And then we would request that URL. We don't care what it is. We never look at it. We never construct our own URLs. We just use the ones that the server provided us with. And then that would tell us how to get back this form. So we make that call, and it would give us a forms element, which would have the href you'd be submitting it to, all the data you would need, like the check type, attribute that we did before. You process that form, you send it in, bam, you're done. So sort of high level, again, 30 minutes, so I apologize, very high level stuff, and there's a world of details, but I wanted to give you this flavor of the idea of how you build an API this type. So to recap, you evaluate your business processes to determine what your needs are. You create a state machine that represents those business processes that will inform your media type needs. So you can evaluate what links you need between states and what the data is in each state. And then you create a media type definition that uses those media types that's informed by your state machine, which is informed by your business process, and then you build it. So that's the steps. I'm writing a book about this. I really wanted to announce that the beta of the book was going to be out today, but I got totally screwed by some client work that was not Jeff last week. And so I didn't actually manage to get the beta done, but about within a week, I'm going to be putting out the beta of my book. So if all this stuff is interesting to you, and if you're scratching your head, which you probably are, again, this is a very high-level overview of this kind of stuff, I will be selling this beta book. It's currently called Get Some Rest. So getsomere.st is the URL. You can put in your email, and I will email you sometime next week. And that's that summary. So again, I am Steve Klabnik. That's my website and the rest website. One of the awesome things that we're doing at Jumpstart Labs, Jumpstart Labs Conf, I can talk about Jumpstart all I want, is that all of our tutorials are online. So the stuff that Jeff was talking about earlier and some other things about learning various Ruby and Rails techniques, it's all open source and it's all on the website. So it's a really good place to learn if you're trying to learn some stuff. So that's tutorials.jumpstartlabs.com. That's all that stuff. So I'm sure you have questions, so you can ask me later because they're probably going to get long and complicated. So thanks for listening. I'll see you all around.